There is a valley in the southern spine of the Appalachian range that has never once appeared on a printed county map. Not in 1880, not in 1920, not in the WPA surveys of the 1930s, not on any satellite overlay you can pull up today. If you go looking for it in the State Geological Survey archives, you will find a clean white rectangle where the topographic contour lines simply stop. No elevation data, no drainage notation, no road, no trail, no structure. Just an absence, pressed flat into the paper like someone laid a ruler across the mountains and decided that 7 miles of ridgeline and 2,000 acres of hollow simply did not exist. The county seat has no deed recorded under the name Savage prior to 1954, even though census takers documented members of the family living in that hollow as far back as 1830. The post office operated a rural route that passed within 4 miles of the hollow's mouth for over 60 years, but the carrier's logbook contains no entry for any delivery or pickup at any address associated with the family. The one-room schoolhouse that served the surrounding district has attendance rolls stretching back to 1887. Not a single Savage child appears on any of them. And the county's own tax assessor, a man named Orrin Dills, who held the office for 29 consecutive years, filed annual reports that accounted for every parcel in the township except one. The missing parcel sat directly over the hollow. His reports do not mention it. They do not skip a number. They simply proceed as though the land were not there. This is not an accident of record keeping. This is not a filing error or a clerical gap. When you lay all of the documents side by side, when you walk the exposed shelves of the county clerk's office and cross-reference the plat books against the field surveyor's original chain notes, what you find is a pattern so deliberate that it can only be described as coordinated erasure. Someone, at some point, made a decision, and the machinery of local government carried that decision forward for more than a century, adjusting the paperwork, redirecting the roads, and pretending that an entire family and the ground they stood on had never been part of the record at all. This is the story of the Savage family, the hollow they built, and the county that tried to make them disappear. If you have ever come across a place that seems to exist in the physical world but not in any official record, a place where the road bends around something that should be there but isn't, drop a comment below and tell us about it. Because what you are about to hear suggests that this kind of erasure was not rare. It was policy. The hollow itself sits in a county whose name we are going to withhold for now, not because the information is secret, but because the handful of people still living in the surrounding area have asked, repeatedly, that outsiders stop coming. The last time someone posted coordinates online, a group of amateur explorers cut through a cattle fence, crossed 2 miles of private timberland, and ended up standing on the front porch of an 86-year-old woman who had no idea why strangers were taking photographs of her barn. That woman is a savage. She is one of the last ones still living on the original ground, and she does not want to be found. What we can tell you is that the hollow lies in the central Appalachian belt, in a state that borders at least 2 others along the ridgeline. The nearest paved road is a 2-lane state highway that was not completed until 1948, and even that road curves in a way that routes traffic around the hollow's drainage rather than through it. The nearest incorporated town is 11 miles by road, but less than 4 as the crow flies, separated by a single ridge that tops out at just over 3,000 feet. On the other side of that ridge, the ground drops sharply into a narrow valley with a year-round creek running through the bottom. The creek has no name on any USGS quadrangle. The valley it carved has no name in any county record, but the people who lived on that creek for generations called it Savage Branch, and the valley it drained was simply the hollow. The topography of the hollow is unusual in ways that even a casual observer would notice. Most Appalachian hollows are asymmetrical. One wall is steeper than the other. The creek runs closer to one side. The bottomland is narrow at one end and wider at the other. The Savage Hollow is different. It is almost perfectly symmetrical, as though the ridge had been split down its center by a force that distributed the resulting valley evenly on both sides of the creek. The walls rise at nearly identical angles. The bottomland maintains a consistent width for more than a mile before tapering at each end. Geologists who have examined aerial photographs of the hollow have noted that this degree of symmetry is unusual for a valley carved by natural erosion. It is not impossible, but it is uncommon enough to raise questions about whether the valley's shape was modified at some point in the past, either by the savage family or by whoever occupied the land before them. There are precedents for this kind of landscape modification in the pre-Columbian southeast, where indigenous peoples reshaped valleys and ridgelines to suit agricultural and ceremonial purposes. Whether any such modification occurred in the Savage Hollow has never been investigated. The first verifiable mention of the Savage family in any written source comes from a circuit preacher's journal dated 1829. The preacher, whose name appears in multiple regional church archives, was travelling through the mountains on a route that took him through settlements that would later become small towns. In his journal, he describes crossing a high gap and descending into what he calls a shut-in valley of considerable depth, where he encountered a family of at least 12 individuals living in 2 log structures near a creek. He notes that the family had cleared perhaps 10 acres of bottomland and was growing corn, squash, and a variety of bean he did not recognize. He describes the patriarch as a tall man with grey eyes, who spoke in a dialect the preacher found difficult to follow. The family name, as the preacher recorded it, was Savage. The preacher stayed one night. He noted that the family declined his offer of a sermon but fed him well and gave him a place to sleep near the fire. He records that the meal consisted of cornbread, stewed game, and a dish made from the unfamiliar bean that he found surprisingly flavourful. He noted that the food was prepared in heavy iron pots that appeared to be of local manufacture, cast in moulds rather than hammered, which was itself unusual for a backcountry household of that period. He makes one additional observation that later researchers have spent considerable time discussing. He writes that the walls of the main structure were built from logs of unusual size, and that the joinery was done without visible iron hardware. The corners were fitted using a technique he had not seen before, one that he compared imprecisely to the dovetail work he had observed in German settlements in Pennsylvania, but tighter and with a different angle at the joint. He also notes that the chimney was built from cut stone, not field stone, and that the stones were fitted so closely that he could not insert his knife blade between them. That journal entry is the earliest known document placing the Savage family in the hollow, but the preacher's observations deserve closer attention, because the details he records are not the details you would expect from a family that had recently arrived in the backcountry. The joinery he describes, corners fitted without iron hardware using a technique he compared to but distinguished from Pennsylvania German dovetailing, is not a method that a family would develop in a single generation of frontier living. It is a refined technique. It requires precision tooling, an understanding of wood movement across seasons, and a tradition of practice that passes from one builder to the next over long periods of time. Frontier cabins of that era were typically built with saddle notching or simple V-notching, fast methods that could be executed with an axe and minimal skill. What the preacher saw was something different entirely. The chimney is even more telling. Cut stone, as opposed to field stone, requires quarrying. It requires tools capable of splitting and shaping stone along its grain, and it requires knowledge of which stone in the local geology is suitable for cutting. Fieldstone chimneys were the standard in the region because they could be built from material gathered on the surface without any specialized skill. A cut stone chimney in a log dwelling in the Appalachian backcountry in 1829 is an anomaly. It implies either that the builders brought their skills from somewhere else, or that they had been in place long enough to develop them independently. Either way, it does not fit the profile of a recently arrived frontier family. There is also the matter of the beans. The preacher notes that the family was growing a variety of bean he did not recognize. This seems like a small detail, but it carries weight. Circuit preachers of that era were well-travelled men who passed through dozens of communities in a single year. They saw the full range of crops that Appalachian families cultivated. For a preacher to encounter a crop he could not identify suggests that the Savage family was growing something that was not part of the common agricultural repertoire of the region. Whether it was a locally adapted cultivar, a variety obtained through trade with indigenous peoples, or something else entirely, it points to a food system that was operating outside the norms of the surrounding communities. Before we move on to what the land itself reveals, stop for a second. What you just heard about the construction techniques the circuit preacher recorded is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original field journal entry, the dovetail angle, the mortarless chimney. It's all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. But there is strong circumstantial evidence that the family had been there much longer than even these details suggest. The cleared bottomland, the preacher describes, 10 acres of agricultural use, would have taken a small family working without draft animals at least 15 to 20 years to establish in that soil and that terrain. The log structures he describes, particularly the stonework chimney, suggest permanence. These were not squatters passing through. They were settled, rooted, and by all appearances they had been there long enough to develop techniques and practices that struck even a well-travelled preacher as unusual. Over the next 3 decades, additional references to the Savage family appear in scattered sources. A land speculator's letter from 1,837 mentions being warned away from a particular hollow by a local trader who said the family living there did not welcome strangers and had been known to fire warning shots over the heads of anyone who approached without calling out first. A military enrollment list from the Civil War period includes no Savage from the county in question, which is notable because the list includes names from every other settlement in the township, including several that were smaller and more remote than the hollow. And a county judge's private correspondence from 1,858, discovered in a university archive in the 1970s, contains a single line that has generated more discussion than almost any other document in the local record. The judge writes to a colleague in the state capital that he has received a petition from residents of the township requesting that the county take formal notice of a family living in the upper drainage who have neither paid tax, nor submitted to survey, nor presented themselves at any public proceeding within memory. That letter is important for 2 reasons. First, it confirms that by 1858, the Savage family's isolation was not merely geographical, it was legal. They were not participating in the civic structures that surrounded them. They were not paying taxes. They were not submitting to surveys. They were not appearing in court, at town meetings, or at any official gathering. Second, and more significantly, the judge does not respond to the petition by ordering an investigation or dispatching a sheriff. He responds by telling his colleague that the matter is best left alone and that the petition should be set aside without action. He offers no explanation for this decision. He simply moves on to the next item in the letter, which concerns a road appropriation. That phrase, best left alone, appears again and again in the documentary record surrounding the Savage family. It shows up in a tax assessor's marginal note from 1,871. It appears in the minutes of a township supervisors meeting in 1889 in reference to a motion to extend a county road through the upper valley. The motion was tabled, and the clerk's annotation reads, in cramped handwriting at the bottom of the page, "Valley route declined per standing direction. Best left alone." It appears one final time in a handwritten memorandum attached to a 1,903 survey contract, in which the county instructs the surveying firm to begin its work at a particular creek junction and proceed east, explicitly omitting the drainage to the west. The memorandum is unsigned, but the paper stock and filing location match other documents generated by the county commissioner's office during the same period. What this means is that the erasure of the Savage family from the official record was not passive neglect, it was active policy. Someone with authority had decided, at some point before 1858, that the family and their hollow were to be excluded from the county's administrative machinery, and that decision was carried forward by successive office holders who followed the same directive without, apparently, ever questioning it or recording the reason behind it. The question that every researcher who has looked into this case eventually arrives at is the same one. Why? Why would a county government go to such lengths to pretend that a family and their land did not exist? The usual explanations for gaps in the Appalachian record do not apply here. This was not a family that moved frequently, they stayed. This was not a family that lived so far from any settlement that contact was impractical. The nearest established community was less than 5 miles away. This was not a family that lacked the numbers or the presence to register in public memory. By the 1870s, Local oral tradition was rich with stories about the savages. Everyone in the surrounding townships knew they were there. Everyone had a story. But the paperwork said otherwise. One line of explanation focuses on land title. In the decades after the Revolution, large tracts of Appalachian land were claimed under grants issued by state legislatures, many of which overlapped with earlier claims made under colonial authority. In some cases, the same parcel of land was claimed by 2 or 3 different parties, each holding a grant they believed to be valid. The legal resolution of these overlapping claims dragged on for decades and was often settled not by courts but by physical occupation. Whoever was on the land stayed on the land, and in some cases the simplest way to resolve a conflicting claim was to pretend that the land in question was empty. If no one was recorded as living there, then no one had standing to challenge a claim. The parcel could be held in reserve, traded among speculators, or simply left off the books until the political moment was right to assign it. There is circumstantial evidence that this is what happened with the Savage Hollow. A land grant issued in 1803 by the state legislature awarded a block of approximately 4,000 acres to a military veteran whose service entitled him to a bounty claim. The boundaries described in that grant, when plotted against modern topographic maps, encompass the entirety of the hollow and extend several miles beyond it in every direction. The grantee never occupied the land. He sold the grant to a speculator in 1811, and the speculator's heirs held the paper title through the end of the century without ever visiting the property. If the Savage family had been acknowledged in the official record, if their occupation of the hollow had been documented, it would have created a competing claim against the paper title. And paper titles, in that era, were worth money. They were traded. They were collateralized. They were used to secure loans and to establish political standing. Acknowledging the Savages would have undermined the value of the grant. The speculator who purchased the grant in 1811 was a man with significant political connections in the state capital. He held interests in multiple land grants across the region and was known to have close relationships with several members of the state legislature who served on the committee that adjudicated disputed land claims. His correspondence, portions of which survive in a university collection, reveals a man who understood the value of controlling information about the land he claimed. In one letter, written to a business partner in 1814, he advises that the best way to protect a speculative claim is to ensure that no contrary evidence enters the public record, and that any occupant of the claimed land should be treated as invisible to the instruments of the state. Whether this advice was applied specifically to the Savage Hollow is impossible to confirm, but the timing is suggestive. The speculator acquired the grant in 1811. The earliest documented instance of the county's policy of omission dates to the 1830s, and the speculator's stated strategy, making occupants invisible to the instruments of the state, is a precise description of what happened to the Savage family. The speculator died in 1838. His heirs, who lived far from the mountains and had no direct knowledge of the land their father had claimed, continued to hold the paper title as a speculative asset. They paid no taxes on it, because the county had no record of the parcel. They made no improvements, because they never visited. And the family that actually lived on the land continued to be excluded from the public record, maintaining the fiction that the land was unoccupied and the paper title was unchallenged. This arrangement persisted for generations, long after the original speculator's motivations had been forgotten and long after his heirs had lost any practical interest in the property. The county continued the policy of omission not because anyone was actively protecting a land claim, but because the institutional habit of erasure had become self-sustaining. No one remembered why the hollow was excluded, but no one questioned the exclusion either. The directive was followed because it had always been followed, but this explanation, while plausible, does not account for the intensity of the erasure. Land title disputes were common. They did not typically result in a century-long policy of omission from every county record. Something else was at work. And the clues to that something else lie in the physical characteristics of the hollow itself. The first systematic physical description of the hollow that we know of comes from a timber cruiser's field notes dated 1897. Timber cruising, for those unfamiliar with the term, was the practice of walking through forested land to estimate the volume and value of standing timber. In the 1890s, as the great timber boom swept through the Appalachians, cruisers were sent into virtually every valley, hollow, and ridge in the region. Their notes are among the most detailed physical descriptions of the pre-industrial mountain landscape that exist. This particular cruiser was working for a company that had acquired cutting rights to a large tract of land adjacent to the hollow. His assignment did not include the hollow itself, but his notes indicate that he entered it briefly, apparently out of curiosity, after noticing what he described as an unusual feature on the ridge above the drainage. He writes that he climbed to the ridge crest and observed, on the far side, a valley that was deeper and more regular in its shape than any I have encountered in this range. He describes the valley walls as steep but not precipitous, with a flat bottom perhaps 300 yards wide at its broadest point. The creek running through the bottom was clear and cold and ran over a bed of flat stones that appeared, in his words, to have been laid or arranged rather than deposited by natural action. He descended into the valley and walked approximately 1 mile along the creek before encountering signs of habitation. He describes a series of stone walls running perpendicular to the creek, dividing the bottomland into what he interpreted as agricultural plots. The walls were between 2 and 3 feet high, built from flat stones stacked without mortar, and were in excellent condition despite what he estimated to be considerable age. Beyond the walls, he came upon a cluster of structures. He counted 4 buildings, all built from logs of what he identified as chestnut and white oak. The largest structure, which he took to be the main dwelling, measured approximately 40 feet in length and was built with the same tight-cornered joinery that the circuit preacher had described nearly 70 years earlier. The chimney was stone, the roof was wood shingle, and the door, he notes with evident surprise, was hung on iron hinges that appeared to have been forged on site. He encountered no one. The buildings appeared occupied, but the residents were absent, likely working elsewhere in the hollow or in the surrounding forest. He did not stay long, but before he left, he made one observation that has become the single most discussed detail in the entire Savage Hollow record. He writes that on the interior wall of the main dwelling, near the door, he observed a series of marks carved into the log surface. He describes them as characters or signs arranged in horizontal rows, each row containing between 8 and 15 individual marks. He counted 6 rows visible near the door, and estimated that additional rows might be present elsewhere in the structure. He did not recognize the marks as belonging to any alphabet or numbering system he was familiar with. He sketched several of them in the margin of his field notes. Those sketches survived. They were included in the cruiser's report to his employer, and the report was eventually donated to a regional university archive as part of a larger collection of logging-era documents. When researchers examined the sketches in the 1980s, they initially assumed them to be tally marks or some form of agricultural record-keeping, but closer analysis revealed that the marks were too varied and too systematically arranged to be simple tallies. Each character was distinct, the spacing between them was consistent, and the arrangement in horizontal rows, reading left to right, is a pattern associated with written language, not with counting. No one has ever definitively identified the marks. Several linguists who examined photographs of the sketches in the 1990s noted similarities to certain Cherokee syllabary characters, but the correspondences were not close enough to support a firm identification. Others have pointed out resemblances to marks found in pre-contact petroglyphs in the Ohio Valley region, but those comparisons are even more tenuous. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that someone in the Savage family, at some point before 1897, was using a system of marks that was not English, was not any recognized European script, and was applied to the interior of their home in a manner consistent with written communication. This observation opens a line of inquiry that the physical evidence in the hollow continues to support. The Savage family, by every available indication, was not simply an isolated mountain family living at the margins of settlement. They were something else. Their construction techniques were unusually refined. Their agricultural practices, as described by the preacher and later observers, were unusually productive for the terrain. Their stone walls were built with a precision that local farmers did not replicate, and their possible use of a written system, if that is what the marks represent, would place them outside the expected cultural framework of the Appalachian backcountry entirely. This does not mean that the savage family was supernatural or otherworldly. It means that they possessed knowledge and skills that the surrounding community did not recognize, and that the county, for reasons we are still piecing together, chose to suppress rather than document. The erasure was not just administrative, it was epistemic. The county was not merely failing to record the family's existence, it was actively preventing the creation of any record that might lead someone to investigate what the family knew and how they lived. The Timber Cruiser's report, with its sketches of the wall marks and its description of the unusual construction techniques, was filed with a logging company and eventually forgotten. It did not enter the public record. It did not trigger any investigation, and the county continued its policy of omission without interruption. What makes the wall marks even more significant is the context in which they were found. Literacy rates in rural Appalachia in the late 19th century were low. Many families in the surrounding townships could not read or write English. The presence of any systematic notation in a mountain dwelling would have been noteworthy, but the presence of a notation system that was not English, not Cherokee, and not any other recognized script elevates the finding from noteworthy to genuinely unexplained. It suggests either that the savage family maintained a private knowledge tradition that included its own form of record-keeping, or that they inherited a system from an earlier source, one that predated their settlement in the Hollow, and that they preserved as part of their domestic life. The family's relationship with the surrounding communities adds another layer to this picture. Oral histories collected from elderly residents of the neighboring townships in the 1970s and 1980s describe the savages in terms that mix respect, curiosity, and a certain wariness. One informant, a man in his 90s who had grown up on a farm less than 6 miles from the Hollow, recalled that his grandfather had told him the savages knew things about the ground that other people had forgotten. He said his grandfather believed the family could predict weather with uncanny accuracy, that they knew where water ran underground before anyone dug a well, and that they could identify plants and their uses in ways that went beyond the common herbal knowledge of the region. Another informant, a woman whose family had operated the Crossroads store for 3 generations, said the savages rarely came to trade and were always brief when they did. They paid in coin or in barter goods, never in credit. They did not linger. They did not gossip. And they never bought items that a self-sufficient family would have been expected to produce for itself, things like rope, candles, or soap, which every other family in the township purchased regularly. What they did buy was salt, iron stock, and occasionally glass. The woman recalled that her grandmother had once commented that the savages lived like people who had never been taught to need anything from the outside. A third informant, a retired schoolteacher who had spent her career in the township's one-room school, said that she had once, in the 1940s, encountered a savage child at the crossroads. The child, a girl of about 10, was waiting while an older family member conducted business at the store. The teacher attempted to engage the girl in conversation and was struck by the child's vocabulary and composure. She said the girl spoke in a manner that was old-fashioned but precise, using words and sentence structures that the teacher associated with formal education rather than rural speech. The teacher asked the girl if she attended school. The girl said no. The teacher asked who taught her. The girl said, "Everyone teaches everyone in the Hollow." The teacher said it was the most unsettling and impressive encounter she had with a child in 40 years of teaching, because the girl spoke with the confidence of someone who had been thoroughly educated but in a system that the teacher could not identify. These oral accounts paint a picture of a family that was not merely isolated but deliberately separate. They were not cut off from the world by geography alone. They were cut off by choice. And the skills, knowledge, and practices they maintained within the Hollow were sufficiently different from those of the surrounding communities to generate a persistent undercurrent of wonder and unease among their neighbors. By the early 20th century, the savage family's presence in the Hollow was an open secret throughout the surrounding townships. Everyone knew they were there. Hunters encountered them in the forest. Traders occasionally did business with them at the Crossroads store 11 miles down the road. Children from neighboring farms told stories about the Hollow that mixed genuine observation with the kind of embellishment that isolation breeds, but the official record remained blank. The family did not appear on the 1900 census. They did not appear on the 1910 census, and when the county undertook a comprehensive road survey in 1912, the surveyor's map shows the road network terminating at the base of the ridge that separates the hollow from the nearest township, with no notation indicating what lay on the other side. The first crack in this wall of official silence came in 1934. The federal government, through the Works Progress Administration, began conducting a series of surveys and interviews across Appalachian communities as part of a broader effort to document the region's folklore and economic conditions. WPA field workers were sent into remote areas that state and county agencies had long ignored. They were given broad latitude to record whatever they found. And one of them, a young woman from a university in the eastern part of the state, was assigned to the township that bordered the Savage Hollow. Her name appears in the WPA's administrative records, but the field reports she submitted have a complicated history. The original copies, which should be in the state archives, are missing. What survives are carbon copies that she apparently kept for herself and that were found among her personal papers after her death in 1987. Those carbon copies contain interviews with 17 individuals from the surrounding area, 12 of whom mention the Savage family by name. They also contain one document that exists nowhere else in the known record. It is a physical description of the hollow, based on what the field worker describes as a visit she made in the spring of 1934, accompanied by a local guide who had traded with the family on several occasions. The field worker's account is the most detailed description of the hollow and its inhabitants that exists for the first half of the 20th century. She describes approaching the hollow on foot from the east, following a narrow path that led up and over the ridge. She notes that the path was well worn but unmarked, and that her guide told her it had been in use for as long as anyone could remember. When they reached the ridge crest, she describes looking down into a valley that struck her as remarkably ordered for a place so remote. She could see cultivated fields along the creek bottom, several structures clustered together near the center of the valley, and what appeared to be a stone-lined channel diverting water from the creek to the fields. The stone-lined channel, she observed, is a detail that deserves particular attention. Irrigation channels of that type, stone-lined diversions designed to move water from a creek to agricultural fields, are not a feature of traditional Appalachian farming. Mountain farmers in the region relied on rain-fed agriculture. They planted in bottomlands that naturally received moisture from creek flooding, or they carried water by hand. The construction of a permanent irrigation channel implies a level of agricultural planning and engineering that was not practiced in the surrounding communities. It implies a community that was not simply growing food but managing water, shaping the landscape to suit its needs rather than adapting to whatever conditions the terrain presented. The closest parallels to what the field worker described are found not in Appalachian farming traditions but in the agricultural systems of the pre-Columbian Southeast, where indigenous peoples built elaborate water management features to support large-scale cultivation. Whether there is a connection between those systems and what the Savage family built in the hollow is unknown, but the resemblance is striking enough to have been noted by every researcher who has examined the field worker's account. She descended into the valley and was met by a man she estimated to be in his 60s. He identified himself as Elias Savage and told her that his family had lived in the hollow since before the county had a name. He was courteous but guarded. He agreed to answer some of her questions, but declined to allow her inside any of the structures. She conducted her interview in the yard, sitting on a stone bench that she describes as having been carved from a single block of sandstone. Elias told her that the family numbered 14 at that time, spread across 3 generations. He said they grew most of what they ate, hunted, and trapped for the rest, and traded surplus produce and hides at the crossroads store for the few things they could not make or grow themselves. He said they had no use for the county's roads because the hollow had its own paths. He said they had no use for the county's schools because the family educated its own children. And when she asked him why the family did not appear on any official record, he gave her an answer that she underlined twice in her notes. He said, "We did not ask them to find us, and they did not ask us to be found." The field worker spent approximately 4 hours in the hollow. During that time, she made several observations that expanded on the timber cruiser's account from 4 decades earlier. She noted that the stone walls dividing the agricultural plots were still in excellent condition, and that they extended further than the cruiser had described, running up the hillsides in terraces that created level planting surfaces on the slopes. She counted 7 structures in total, including what appeared to be a workshop or forge, a smokehouse, and a building she could not identify that was set apart from the others and had no visible door on the side facing her. She noted that the construction of all the buildings was consistent, using the same tight-cornered log joinery and cut stone chimneys that earlier accounts had described. She also made one observation that she marked with an asterisk in her notes and returned to several times in subsequent pages. She writes that the main dwelling had a stone foundation that extended well below ground level. When she asked Elias about the depth of the foundation, he told her that the lower level of the house contained a room that was as old as the creek, and that had been there when his grandfather's grandfather first settled the hollow. He did not elaborate, and she did not press him, but she writes in her notes that the implication was clear. The lower room predated the family's arrival. It was already there when they came, and they built over it. This detail raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. If the Savage family arrived in the hollow sometime in the late 18th or very early 19th century, as the documentary evidence suggests, and if the lower room of the main dwelling was already present when they arrived, then someone else built it. Someone else was in that hollow before the Savages, and that someone else built with cut stone, below ground level, in a manner that the family considered significant enough to preserve and build upon rather than demolish or ignore. The WPA fieldworker's report does not speculate on the identity or origin of the earlier builders. She records what she was told and what she observed, and she leaves it at that. But her account, combined with the timber cruiser's observations and the circuit preacher's journal, establishes a consistent picture of a place that does not fit easily into the standard narrative of Appalachian settlement. The construction techniques are too refined, the agricultural system is too systematic, the possible use of a written script is too anomalous, and the existence of a pre-existing stone structure beneath the family dwelling is too significant to be dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. The county's response to all of this was silence. The WPA fieldworker submitted her report through the normal channels. It disappeared. Her requests for follow-up visits were denied without explanation. When she inquired through her supervisor about the disposition of her report, she was told that the material had been forwarded for review, but no further information was available. She wrote at least 2 letters to the state office of the WPA asking for the return of her original report or confirmation of its filing location. Neither letter received a response. The carbon copies she kept were stored in a trunk in her attic for more than 50 years before being discovered by a family member after her death. The fact that she kept copies at all suggests that she anticipated the loss of the originals, that she understood, perhaps from the reactions of her supervisors, that the report contained material that someone did not want preserved. The carbon copies are now held by a small regional archive, and they constitute the only surviving record of her field work in the Savage Hollow. The original report has never been found. Whether it was destroyed, misfiled, or deliberately removed from the WPA's archives is unknown. But its disappearance is consistent with the pattern that characterizes every interaction between the hollow and the institutions that were supposed to document it. And the hollow continued to exist in its peculiar state of official non-existence, known to everyone in the surrounding area but acknowledged by no one in any position of authority. The next major event in the documented history of the Savage Hollow occurred in 1951, and it represents the single most aggressive action the county ever took against the family. In the spring of that year, the State Highway Department announced plans to extend a secondary road through the upper portion of the township, connecting 2 communities that had previously been linked only by unpaved tracks. The proposed route, as initially drawn, would have passed through the eastern edge of the Savage Hollow. This would have required the state to survey the land, acquire right-of-way, and formally acknowledge the existence of the hollow and its inhabitants in the public record. The implications were obvious to anyone who understood the county's long history of omission. A state survey would mean state surveyors walking the hollow. State engineers would draw the drainage on official maps. State lawyers would need to establish right-of-way. and the entire apparatus of denial that the county had maintained for over a century would collapse under the weight of a single road project. The county moved quickly to prevent this. Within weeks of the Highway Department's announcement, the County Commission voted to recommend an alternate route that would bypass the hollow entirely, adding 7 miles to the road's length and requiring the construction of 2 additional bridges. The official justification for the alternate route was topographic unsuitability of the original path, but a review of the topographic data shows that the original route was, if anything, more favorable than the alternative. It followed a natural grade along the creek bottom, required fewer cuts and fills, and avoided the 2 creek crossings that necessitated bridges. The alternate route was more expensive, more difficult to build, and longer. It made no engineering sense. The County Commission's recommendation was accepted by the state without challenge. The road was built along the alternate route, and the hollow remained unsurveyed, unmapped, and officially non-existent. But the 1951 road controversy had an unintended consequence. It drew attention. A reporter for a regional newspaper covering the road construction project learned about the alternate route and began asking questions about why the shorter, cheaper path had been rejected. His inquiries led him to the hollow, and in the summer of 1952, he published a 3-part series in the newspaper about the Savage family and their unrecorded valley. The series was not sensational. The reporter was careful, methodical, and restrained. He described the family, the hollow, and the county's long history of omission in factual terms. He quoted county officials who either denied near knowledge of the family or declined to comment. He interviewed residents of surrounding communities who confirmed the family's presence and expressed varying degrees of puzzlement and indifference about the county's refusal to acknowledge them. And he documented, for the first time in a public forum, the pattern of deliberate exclusion that ran through the county's records. What the reporter found most striking, and what he devoted the entire 3rd installment of his series to exploring, was the consistency of the erasure across different offices and different eras. The tax assessor's omission was one thing. That could be explained as a single individual's decision. But the census taker's omission was a different office, a different level of government, and in most cases a different individual from one decade to the next. The surveyor's omission was yet another office. The Road Commission's decisions were made by an elected board that turned over regularly. For all of these offices, across multiple generations of office holders, to maintain the same policy of exclusion required either an extraordinary coincidence or an explicit, standing directive that was passed from one office holder to the next. The reporter concluded that the latter explanation was far more likely, and he noted that the phrase "best left alone," which appeared in records spanning more than 40 years, functioned as exactly that kind of directive. It was not a rationale. It was not an explanation. It was an instruction. And every official who encountered it appears to have followed it without asking why. The series generated modest attention. A few letters to the editor, a brief mention in a state-level newspaper. Nothing that changed the situation on the ground. But it did produce one result that would prove significant decades later. The reporter, in the course of his research, obtained a copy of the 1,803 land grant that covered the hollow. He published the grant's boundary description in the 2nd installment of his series, and he noted that the grant had been transferred multiple times but had never been settled or improved by any of its holders. He raised the obvious question. If the grant holders had never occupied the land, and the Savage family had occupied it continuously for at least a century, who had the better claim? That question would not be answered for another 40 years. In the meantime, the family continued to live as they always had. The hollow remained off the map, and the county continued its policy of silence. The 1960s and 1970s brought changes to the surrounding area that began to press against the hollow's boundaries. Logging operations expanded into adjacent ridges. A small coal prospect was opened on the north side of the ridge that formed the hollow's upper wall. And a new generation of county officials, less connected to the old agreements and less inclined to maintain them without understanding why, began to ask the same questions that the 1,952 newspaper series had raised. Why was this parcel excluded? Who authorized the exclusion? And what was the legal basis for continuing it? The coal prospect deserves particular attention because it brought the first industrial activity within sight of the hollow. The prospecting company had obtained mineral rights to a tract on the north side of the ridge through a lease arrangement with the surface owner. Their exploratory drilling and trenching took them to within a few hundred yards of the ridge crest, close enough that the workers could look down into the hollow and see the fields, the structures, and the people moving among them. Several of the workers later told researchers that they had been instructed by their foreman not to cross the ridge and not to make contact with anyone on the other side. When asked who had given the foreman those instructions, the workers said they did not know, but they assumed it came from the company's landman, who handled all the surface and mineral rights negotiations with the county. The coal prospect ultimately proved uneconomical and was abandoned after 2 seasons of exploratory work. But during those 2 seasons, something happened that no one anticipated. The prospecting crew's presence on the ridge disturbed the drainage on the north slope, and the runoff from their test trenches altered the flow of a small tributary that fed into Savage Branch. The creek level in the hollow dropped noticeably. One of the oral history informants, a man who had hunted the ridges above the hollow as a young man in the 1970s, said he had seen what appeared to be the remains of a stone dam or weir in the creek bed that had been exposed by the lower water level. He described it as a line of flat stones set on edge, running across the full width of the creek at a point approximately halfway along the hollow's length. He said it looked deliberate, not like a natural ledge, and that it appeared to be very old. He did not cross into the hollow to examine it more closely, and the creek level returned to normal after the prospecting company filled its trenches. No photograph of the structure exists, and no researcher has been able to confirm its presence. But if accurate, the account would add another anomalous feature to the hollow's inventory, a stone weir that might have served as part of the water management system that the WPA fieldworker observed in 1934. These questions gained urgency in 1978, when the state legislature passed a comprehensive property tax reform that required every county to conduct a full reassessment of all real property within its borders. The law was clear. Every parcel had to be assessed. Every landowner had to be identified, and every assessment had to be completed within 3 years. The county assessor at the time, a man who had held the office for only 4 years and who had no connection to the Dills family or the earlier policy of omission, confronted the hollow question directly. He drove to the ridge, walked to the crest, and looked down into the valley. He saw what every other observer had seen: fields, structures, a functioning settlement, people living on the land. He returned to his office and attempted to create a tax record for the parcel. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. When he entered the parcel information into the county's record system, the system rejected it. The parcel number he assigned had already been allocated to a different tract on the other side of the county. He tried a different number, same result. He tried a third, same result. Every parcel number he attempted to assign was already in use, despite the fact that the county's parcel numbering system had gaps in its sequence that should have accommodated new entries. He consulted the county's parcel index, a handwritten ledger that had been maintained since the original numbering system was established in the 1870s. He looked for unused numbers that he could assign. There were none. Every number in the sequence was accounted for, but when he cross-referenced the parcel numbers against their physical locations on the plat maps, he found something that should have been impossible. The numbers were sequential for every property in the township, except the range that should have corresponded to the hollow's location. That range had been assigned to properties on the other side of the county, properties that already had their own numbers in the correct local sequence. In other words, the numbers that should have been available for the hollow had been deliberately reassigned to cover the gap, creating a seamless numerical sequence that left no empty slot, no visible skip, and no indication that any parcel was missing. This was not sloppiness. This was engineering. Someone had sat down with the numbering system and redesigned it to make the hollow's absence invisible even to someone examining the records closely. The only way to detect the manipulation was to do exactly what the assessor had done, to stand on the ridge looking at a valley full of buildings and fields, and then try to enter it into a system that had been mathematically sealed against its inclusion. He brought the problem to the county clerk, who examined the parcel records and confirmed the assessor's finding. The numbering system had been deliberately constructed to exclude the hollow. The sequence of parcel numbers jumped over the range that would have corresponded to the hollow's location, as though someone had built the exclusion into the mathematical structure of the record-keeping system itself. It was not a matter of simply leaving the parcel out. The system had been designed, from the ground up, to make it impossible to add the parcel in. The assessor reported this finding to the county commission. The commission discussed the matter in a closed session. No minutes of that session have ever been released. And the reassessment was completed with the hollow once again excluded. The state accepted the county's filing without comment. By the 1980s, the Savage family had dwindled. The WPA fieldworkers' account in 1934 described 14 family members. By 1985, local sources estimated the number at fewer than 10. Young people had begun to leave, drawn out by the same forces that were depopulating rural communities throughout Appalachia. The hollow's fields, once meticulously maintained, showed signs of contraction. Fewer acres were under cultivation. Some of the outlying structures appeared to be unoccupied. The family was still there, but it was shrinking. It was during this period that the first academic researchers gained access to the hollow. A folklorist from a regional university, working on a study of material culture in isolated Appalachian communities, made contact with the family through a series of intermediaries and was eventually granted permission to visit. She spent 3 days in the hollow in the summer of 1986 and produced a 40-page report that remains the most thorough academic description of the site. Her report confirms and expands upon every previous account. The stone walls were still standing, the construction techniques were still evident in the surviving structures. The stone foundation beneath the main dwelling was still intact, and she was allowed to see the lower room that the WPA fieldworker had been told about but never entered. She describes it as a rectangular chamber, approximately 12 feet by 16 feet, with walls of cut stone rising to a ceiling height of just over 6 feet. The ceiling was formed by flat stone slabs laid across the width of the room. The floor was beaten earth. The room was dry, cool, and lightless, and the family was using it for food storage, though the folklorist noted that the construction was far more elaborate than any root cellar she had encountered in the region. She noted one additional detail about the underground room that does not appear in any earlier account. Along the base of the east wall, just above the floor level, she observed a horizontal groove cut into the stone. The groove was approximately 2 inches wide and 1 inch deep, and it ran the full length of the wall. It appeared to be a drainage channel, designed to collect any moisture that seeped through the stone and direct it to a small opening at the corner of the room, which led to a narrow drain that exited through the foundation and presumably emptied outside the structure. This is a sophisticated moisture management feature. It is not something you would find in a typical root cellar. It is something you would find in a structure designed for long-term preservation of materials that needed to be kept dry. Documents, textiles, seeds. Whatever was stored in that room, the builders had taken extraordinary care to protect it from water damage. The folklorist also recorded the dimensions and construction details of the other structures in the hollow. The workshop or forge she identified was equipped with an anvil, a stone-lined fire pit with a bellows mount, and a collection of hand tools that included several items she could not identify. One tool, which she described as a curved blade set in a wooden handle at an unusual angle, did not correspond to any implement in the standard toolkit of an Appalachian blacksmith. She photographed it but was unable to determine its function. Another tool appeared to be a stoneworking chisel of a type she had not seen outside of museum collections. Its presence in an active workshop suggested that the family was still working in stone, still maintaining the tradition that had produced the walls and foundations that earlier observers had noted. She also examined the marks on the interior walls that the timber cruiser had sketched in 1897. She found them still visible, though weathered. She photographed them extensively and submitted the photographs to colleagues in linguistics and anthropology. Their assessments were inconclusive. The marks did not correspond to any known writing system. They were not random, they were not decorative, and they were too systematically arranged to be explained as tally marks or property indicators. The consensus among the scholars who examined them was that they represented either a private notation system developed within the family or a relic of an older system whose origins could not be determined from the available evidence. The folklorist's report circulated in academic channels but received little attention. The hollow was too small, too obscure, and too difficult to access to attract the kind of sustained scholarly interest that might have led to a full archaeological survey. And the family, while tolerant of the folklorist's visit, made it clear that they did not want additional visitors. The report was filed, the photographs were archived, and the hollow continued to exist in its own space, known but unrecorded, visible but officially invisible. One section of the folklorist's report that has received less attention than the construction details and the wall marks, but that may be equally significant, concerns the family's food preservation practices. She observed the contents of the underground room in some detail and noted that the family was storing not only the expected root vegetables and dried meats, but also sealed clay vessels that contained what appeared to be preserved seeds. She counted more than 30 vessels of varying sizes, each sealed with a thick layer of beeswax. When she asked about them, the family member who was accompanying her said only that the vessels contained what grows here, and that the family had been maintaining them for a long time. The folklorist noted that the practice of maintaining sealed seed stores over multiple generations is characteristic of agricultural communities that place a high value on cultivar preservation, communities that understand that the specific varieties they grow are distinct from what is available elsewhere, and that losing them would mean losing something irreplaceable. This is not a practice typically associated with Appalachian subsistence farming, where seeds were commonly saved from one season to the next, but not preserved in sealed containers designed for long-term storage. The clay vessels, the beeswax seals, and the evident age of some of the containers suggest a seed-keeping tradition that is more systematic and more intentional than anything documented in the surrounding region. The folklorist attempted to learn more about the family's agricultural practices during her 3-day visit, but the family was guarded on this subject. They showed her the fields and the stone-walled terraces, but did not explain their planting methods or crop rotation patterns. She observed that the fields appeared to be in excellent condition, with deep, dark soil that contrasted sharply with the thinner, lighter soil on the hillsides above the terraces. She speculated that the family had been amending the soil for generations, building up its fertility through deliberate composting or other organic methods. But she could not confirm this because the family did not discuss their techniques with her. The legal resolution of the hollow's status came, unexpectedly, in 1993. A descendant of the original 1803 land grant holder, acting on advice from a real estate attorney, filed a quiet title action in the county court. The filing claimed uninterrupted chain of title from the original grant and sought to have the court affirm the descendants' ownership of the entire 4,000-acre tract, including the hollow. If the court had granted the motion, the Savage family would have been classified as trespassers on their own land, subject to eviction after more than a century and a half of continuous occupation. The family, for the first time in the documented record, hired an attorney. The attorney, a young lawyer from a neighbouring county who had heard about the case through mutual acquaintances, took the case without fee. His strategy was simple but devastating. He argued that the Savage family's continuous, open and uninterrupted occupation of the hollow for more than 150 years established a claim through adverse possession that superseded any paper title. And he supported that argument with every scrap of documentary evidence that researchers had accumulated over the decades: the Circuit Preacher's Journal, the Timber Cruiser's report, the WPA Fieldworker's account, the newspaper series from 1952, the folklorist's report. The county's own records, with their conspicuous gaps and deliberate omissions, were entered as exhibits demonstrating that the family's occupation was known to the county and had been actively concealed rather than genuinely unknown. The trial lasted 3 days. The plaintiff's attorney presented the chain of title, grant to speculator to heirs, and argued that the paper record was clear. The defense attorney did not dispute the chain of title. Instead, he put the county's own records on trial. He entered exhibit after exhibit, showing the gaps, the omissions, the marginal notes that said best left alone, the road that was rerouted, the parcel numbering system that was mathematically designed to exclude the hollow. He argued that the county's erasure of the family was itself proof of their occupation. You do not go to the trouble of erasing someone who is not there. The very effort to deny the family's existence confirmed it. He also called 3 elderly residents of the surrounding townships who testified under oath that the Savage family had lived in the hollow continuously for as long as anyone could remember. One witness, a man in his late 80s, testified that his great-grandmother had traded with the Savages as a young woman in the 1870s and that the family was already well established at that time. Another witness, a retired mail carrier, testified that the rural route passed within sight of the ridge above the hollow and that he had seen smoke rising from the valley every winter morning for 23 years. The judge who heard the case ruled in the family's favor. The quiet title action was dismissed, and the court ordered the county to create an official parcel record for the hollow, assign it a parcel number, and record the Savage family as its owners of record. It was the first time in the hollow's history that its existence was officially acknowledged by any governmental body. The county complied with the court order, but grudgingly, the parcel was assigned a number. A deed was recorded, but the county's GIS system, which had been implemented in the late 1980s, was not updated to reflect the new parcel. The digital map continued to show the hollow as empty, unassigned land. This was corrected in 2004 after a second court order. But even today, some online mapping services show the area as undeveloped forest with no structures, no roads, and no indication that anyone has ever lived there. The satellite imagery is there. If you know where to look, you can see the clearings, the stone walls, the remaining structures. But the official overlay, the layer that names places and marks roads and identifies property boundaries, remains incomplete. The 1993 ruling had consequences that extended beyond the immediate question of land ownership. The court's finding that the county had engaged in deliberate concealment opened the door to additional legal claims. The family's attorney filed a follow-up motion requesting that the county compensate the family for decades of denied public services, specifically road access, mail delivery, and educational funding that the family had been excluded from by virtue of their non-existence in the county's records. The county contested the motion, arguing that the family had never requested these services and had, by their own admission, chosen to live apart from the county's administrative structures. The court found merit in both arguments and declined to award compensation, but the judge's opinion included language that has been cited in subsequent legal scholarship on the rights of unrecorded communities. The judge wrote that a government's obligation to provide services does not depend on a citizen's willingness to request them, and that a government that deliberately conceals a citizen's existence cannot then argue that the citizen's failure to seek services constitutes a waiver of the right to receive them. The opinion stopped short of ordering the county to act, but it established a principle that the county's erasure of the family was not merely an administrative irregularity, it was a deprivation. The family did not pursue further legal action. The attorney who had represented them reported that the family's primary interest was in securing legal title to the hollow, which the 1993 ruling had accomplished. They did not want a road. They did not want mail delivery. They did not want the county's attention. They wanted to be left alone, on their own terms this time, with the legal standing to enforce that preference if necessary. The Savage family today is small. Best estimates place the number of family members still living in or near the hollow at fewer than 5. The surrounding area has continued to depopulate. The Crossroads store closed in 2006. The nearest school consolidated with a district 30 miles away. The paved road that was built along the alternate route in 1951 is still the primary access to the region, and it still curves around the hollow rather than through it. The few outsiders who have had contact with the remaining family members in recent years describe a community that has contracted but not collapsed. The gardens are still tended. The stone walls are still maintained in the areas immediately surrounding the occupied structures. Smoke still rises from the chimney in winter. And the family still has no telephone, no electrical service, and no internet connection. They live in the second decade of the 21st century, much as they lived in the second decade of the 20th. Their self-sufficiency is not performative. It is not a lifestyle choice made in reaction to modernity. It is a continuation of a practice so old that modernity never entered the equation. A county emergency services coordinator who visited the hollow in 2019 as part of a rural safety assessment, reported that the occupied dwelling was in sound structural condition, that the water source was clean, and that the family had adequate food stores for the season. He noted that the family was courteous but uninterested in any services the county might offer. He asked if they wanted to be included in the county's emergency notification system. They declined. He asked if they wanted the county to grade the trail that connected the hollow to the nearest road. They declined. He asked if they had any needs at all. The eldest family member, a woman, told him that they had everything they needed and that his visit, while appreciated, was unnecessary. He filed his report and noted that the property appeared on the county's GIS system, but that no address had been assigned. He recommended that an address be created for emergency response purposes. As of the most recent available records, no address has been assigned. The structures in the hollow, the ones that researchers documented in the 1980s, are in varying states of repair. The main dwelling, with its cut stone chimney and its underground room, is still occupied. One or two of the outbuildings have been maintained. Others have collapsed or been reclaimed by the forest. The stone walls that divided the agricultural plots are still visible, though vegetation has overtaken many of the fields they once enclosed. The marks on the interior walls of the main dwelling are still there. No one has yet determined what they mean. No one has conducted a full archaeological survey of the site. No one has excavated the underground room or examined its construction in the kind of detail that might reveal its age and origin. The family has not granted access to researchers since the 1980s, and given the pattern of intrusion and disregard that has characterized the outside world's engagement with the hollow, their reluctance is entirely understandable. A retired professor of historical archaeology who reviewed all of the available documentation on the hollow in 2011 wrote a summary assessment that remains the most recent scholarly evaluation of the site. He concluded that the hollow contains at minimum 4 features of significant archaeological interest. First, the underground chamber beneath the main dwelling, whose construction method, cut stone with fitted slab ceiling and integrated drainage, is unlike any documented root cellar or storage structure in the Appalachian region and may predate the Savage family's arrival by an unknown period. Second, the carved marks on the interior walls, which represent either a private notation system or a surviving fragment of an older writing tradition, in either case a finding of substantial cultural significance. Third, the stone wall system dividing the agricultural bottomland, whose construction quality and extent suggest a planned agricultural infrastructure rather than the ad hoc field division typical of the region. And fourth, the stone-lined irrigation channel observed by the WPA fieldworker, which, if still extant, would represent the only known example of pre-industrial stone-lined irrigation in the central Appalachian region. The professor noted that any one of these features, taken individually, would justify a formal archaeological investigation. Taken together, they describe a site that is unlike anything else in the documented record of the region. He recommended that the State Historic Preservation Office initiate contact with the family to discuss the possibility of a non-invasive survey, one that would document the surface features without excavation. His recommendation was forwarded to the appropriate office. No action was taken. The file was marked pending review and has remained in that status for more than a decade. What we are left with is a set of facts that do not resolve neatly. A family lived in a hollow for at least a century and a half, probably longer. They built with techniques that were more refined than those used by surrounding communities. They maintained an agricultural system that was more systematic than anything in the neighboring valleys. They may have used a form of written notation that does not correspond to any known system, and their home was built on top of an underground chamber that they themselves said predated their arrival. The county that was supposed to record, tax, and administer this family and their land chose instead to pretend they did not exist. That choice was maintained for more than 100 years, enforced through deliberate manipulation of records, routes, and administrative systems, and defended against every attempt to reverse it until a court finally intervened. The reason for that choice has never been officially explained. The county has never issued a statement. No official has ever gone on record with a rationale. The documents that might have contained an explanation, if such documents ever existed, have not been found. What we are left with, then, is a hollow in the mountains that should not be there, in the sense that every system designed to acknowledge its existence was deliberately configured to deny it. A family that should be in the record but was kept out. A set of physical features, the stone walls, the underground room, the carved marks, that do not fit the expected pattern and that have never been explained, and a silence from the authorities that lasted longer than most governments survive. There are those who believe that the underground room and the carved marks are evidence of a pre-existing settlement in the hollow, one that predates not just the Savage family but the entire European presence in the Appalachian interior. That the family discovered this settlement when they arrived and built their home over it, and that the county, upon learning of its existence, chose suppression over disclosure because the implications of the site were too disruptive to the accepted historical narrative. Under this interpretation, the erasure was not about land title or tax revenue. It was about controlling what was known and what was permitted to be known about who was in these mountains before the official record begins. Others believe that the Savage family itself was the anomaly, that their construction techniques, their agricultural system, and their possible writing system were not inherited from a pre-existing settlement, but were developed independently through generations of isolation and refinement, that the family represented a cultural lineage that diverged from the mainstream of Appalachian settlement at some early point and evolved along its own trajectory, producing skills and knowledge that the surrounding communities found alien and that the county found threatening. And there are those who believe that the answer lies somewhere in between, that the hollow was already a significant place when the Savage family arrived, that the family recognized its significance and chose to stay, that they built upon what they found, literally and figuratively, and that the resulting combination of inherited site and independent development produced a community that was genuinely unlike anything else in the region, and that the county's response, silence, exclusion, erasure, was the response of a system that did not have a category for what it had found and chose to eliminate the evidence rather than create one. None of these interpretations can be confirmed with the evidence currently available. The underground room has not been excavated, the marks have not been decoded, the county's internal deliberations, if they were ever recorded, have not been found, and the family, the people who know the most about the hollow and its history, are not talking. What can be said, without speculation, is this: the hollow exists, the family lived there, the county erased them, the physical evidence is anomalous. And the questions that the hollow raises about who was in these mountains before the record begins, about what they built and what they knew, about the mechanisms by which official history is constructed and unofficial history is suppressed, remain open. There is a broader pattern here that extends well beyond a single hollow in the Appalachian Mountains. Across the eastern United States, from the ridgelines of Virginia to the hollows of Kentucky to the deep coves of the Smoky Mountains, there are places where the official record does not match the physical evidence. Stone walls in places where no one is recorded as having built them. Foundations in valleys that were supposedly uninhabited before the first European surveys. Agricultural terracing on slopes that the standard historical narrative describes as virgin forest. Carved marks on rock faces and cave walls that do not correspond to any known indigenous writing system. These anomalies are individually small, individually dismissible, individually easy to set aside as curiosities or mistakes, but taken together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The Savage Hollow is not the only place in Appalachia where a family's existence was erased from the official record. It is simply the most thoroughly documented case. Researchers working in county archives across the region have identified similar patterns of omission in at least a dozen other locations, parcels that were skipped in the numbering sequence, tax records that jump over properties that clearly existed, census entries that omit families that neighbours confirm were present, survey maps that leave white spaces where the topography clearly contains something worth recording. In most of these cases, the omitted families or locations share certain characteristics with the Savage Hollow. They are in remote areas. They have been occupied for longer than surrounding properties, and they contain physical features, stone construction, unusual agricultural patterns, or other anomalies that do not fit the expected profile. Whether these omissions are connected, whether they represent a coordinated policy of suppression that extended beyond a single county, or whether they are independent instances of the same bureaucratic impulse, is a question that has not been answered. What can be said is that the mechanism of erasure is consistent. It operates through the same tools everywhere: the tax roll, the survey map, the census form, the parcel number. These are the instruments of official existence, and when they are withheld, the effect is the same regardless of the location. The place and its people cease to exist in the eyes of the state, even as they continue to exist in every other sense. The Savage family understood this. Elias Savage's statement to the WPA fieldworker in 1934, "We did not ask them to find us, and they did not ask us to be found," suggests a family that was aware of its exclusion and had, at least in part, accepted it as a condition of its continued independence. The family did not fight to be included in the county's records. They did not petition for a road. They did not demand a school. They lived as though the county's acknowledgement was irrelevant to their existence, which, in a practical sense, it was. They had their land, they had their crops, they had their knowledge, and they had their hollow with its stone walls and its underground room and its unread marks on the wall. The county's refusal to acknowledge them was, in the family's apparent view, the county's problem, not theirs. But the county's erasure was also a form of theft. By excluding the family from the tax rolls, the county denied them the legal protections that come with documented ownership. By omitting them from the census, it denied them representation and the federal resources that flow from population counts. By leaving them off the maps, it denied them access to roads, schools, postal service, and every other public amenity that the surrounding communities enjoyed. The family's independence was real, but it was also forced. They did not need the county, because the county had made sure they could not have it, and there is a deeper theft buried in the erasure. By refusing to document the hollow's physical features, the unusual construction, the underground room, the carved marks, the county ensured that the knowledge embedded in those features would never enter the broader record. Whatever the Savage family knew about building, about agriculture, about the land itself, remained locked within the hollow, accessible only to the family members who carried it and vulnerable to the same forces of attrition and loss that were slowly reducing the family's numbers. Knowledge that might have enriched the region's understanding of its own past was instead walled off by administrative silence and left to fade with each generation that departed. The next time you look at a map of the Appalachian region, pay attention to the blank spaces, the places where the contour lines stop, the valleys without names, the drainages without roads. Not all of them are empty. Some of them were emptied, and some of them, like the Savage Hollow, were never permitted to be full in the first place. There is a woman in her 80s living in a hollow that has no name on any map. She tends a garden inside stone walls that were built before anyone in the county can remember. Her house sits on a foundation that was old when her family found it, and the marks on the walls of her home have never been read by anyone who could tell her what they say. She is the last of the Savages who stayed, and the county that tried to erase her family has succeeded only in proving that the erasure was the point all along.